The way African Americans view their ancestors and identity has undergone a profound shift. For generations, it was widely accepted that all African Americans were descendants of African slaves brought to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade. They were considered outsiders, people who had been forcibly uprooted from Africa, with ancestors whose identities were tied solely to slavery. But now, as hidden aspects of history come to light, a different narrative is emerging. The ancestors of many African Americans were, in fact, native to America. In contrast, the majority of the white population in the United States today are the real outsiders, having come from Europe. This revelation challenges long-standing beliefs. So what evidence exists that African Americans have indigenous roots in the Americas? In this video, we will explore this. Long before European settlers arrived, the Americas were home to a diverse range of indigenous tribes, each with unique physical features, languages, and cultural practices. Among these tribes, there were those with darker skin, a fact often overlooked or erased in historical accounts. These tribes, such as the Yamasee, Choctaw, and various Caribbean and South American groups, had physical characteristics that resembled those of Africans. Their skin was dark, their hair tightly curled, and their facial features broad. Despite these features, they were indigenous to the Americas. European colonizers, upon encountering these tribes, made assumptions based on their appearance, believing they were of African descent. This mistaken belief would later lead to these dark-skinned tribes being grouped with Africans, erasing their identity as the original inhabitants of the Americas. The dark-skinned Aboriginal tribes were effectively erased from historical records, lumped into the same category as African slaves. However, historical records from European explorers offer glimpses into the existence of these tribes. James Adair, an explorer, wrote about this diversity in his 1775 book, The History of the American Indians. Adair noted the presence of tribes with darker skin tones and even compared them to the Moors of Africa. Other explorers and settlers made similar observations, but their accounts were often colored by racial biases and a desire to categorize people according to European standards. As European colonizers imposed rigid racial hierarchies, these dark-skinned Aboriginal tribes were classified as black, a term that erased their distinct heritage. This erasure served the colonizers' need to maintain a clear racial divide, where Europeans were positioned at the top. Recognizing these dark-skinned people as Native Americans would have disrupted the racial order, challenging the notion of European superiority. Instead, the colonizers chose to lump them together with African slaves, further blurring the lines between Africans and indigenous peoples. This erasure of identity had far-reaching consequences. By categorizing dark-skinned Native Americans as African slaves, European settlers reinforced the idea of racial inferiority, which justified both the institution of slavery and the theft of indigenous lands. This racial categorization also made it easier for settlers to enslave native populations, as it became harder to distinguish between Native Americans and Africans. In the same slave markets, dark-skinned Native Americans were sold alongside Africans, their identities erased, their histories forgotten. Enslavement for these native populations was not just about a loss of freedom, but also about a loss of self. Once enslaved, they were stripped of their cultural practices, languages, and traditions, forced to adopt the customs of their European masters. The intertwining of the enslavement of Africans and Native Americans was no accident. Between 1492 and 1880, it is estimated that 5 million Native Americans were enslaved in the Americas. This occurred alongside the transatlantic slave trade, which brought 5 million Africans to the New World. The two systems of enslavement were deeply interconnected. Dark-skinned Native Americans, because of their physical resemblance to Africans, were particularly vulnerable to being enslaved. European settlers often failed, or chose not to, differentiate between these two groups. As a result, Native Americans were enslaved and sold in the same markets as Africans, and this lack of distinction had profound and lasting effects. The enslavement of dark-skinned Native Americans wasn't just the end of their freedom, it marked the erasure of their identity. Once enslaved, they were forced to abandon their languages, traditions, and spiritual practices. Their identities were rewritten by their captors, who imposed European customs and norms on them. Over time, these dark-skinned Native Americans, stripped of their heritage, were absorbed into the larger African American population. Their stories, their identities as the original inhabitants of America, were forgotten, replaced by the false narrative that all dark-skinned people in America came from Africa. But today, as we uncover these hidden histories, we are beginning to understand the true diversity of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The presence of dark-skinned tribes challenges the simplistic racial distinctions that European settlers imposed on the New World. It complicates the narrative that all dark-skinned people in America are of African descent. It forces us to rethink what we know about the history of race, identity, and belonging in America. The European colonizers' fixation on race and skin color made it difficult for them to categorize these dark-skinned indigenous peoples. If they acknowledged them as Native Americans, it would have undermined the racial hierarchy they were so intent on creating. Instead, by categorizing these tribes as black and associating them with African slaves, they were able to reinforce the idea of European superiority and justify the subjugation of both Native Americans and Africans. This historical erasure served the interests of the colonizers in multiple ways. It provided a rationale for the continued enslavement of both Africans and Native Americans, and it allowed settlers to seize indigenous lands with impunity. By erasing the identities of dark-skinned Native Americans, the settlers could more easily justify their actions. After all, if these people were not truly indigenous, then their claims to the land were less legitimate. The legacy of this erasure is still felt today. Many African Americans who trace their ancestry to the early years of the Americas may find that their ancestors were not African slaves, but dark-skinned Native Americans. This hidden history challenges the dominant narrative of African American identity and opens up new possibilities for understanding the diverse origins of Black Americans. It also raises important questions about race, identity, and belonging. What does it mean to be Black in America? What does it mean to be indigenous? How do these identities intersect, and how have they been shaped by centuries of colonization, slavery, and racial hierarchy? The erasure of dark-skinned Native Americans from history is a reminder of the power of stories, both the ones we tell and the ones we choose to forget. It reminds us that history is not just a record of what happened, but also a reflection of who gets to decide which stories are told. For too long, the stories of dark-skinned Native Americans have been left out of the historical record, their identities erased, their contributions forgotten. But now, as we uncover these hidden histories, we have an opportunity to set the record straight. We can begin to tell a more accurate, more inclusive story of America's past, one that acknowledges the diversity of its indigenous peoples and the complex histories that have shaped the nation. As we continue to explore the history of dark-skinned Native Americans, we are reminded that identity is not fixed. It is shaped by history, by culture, and by the stories we tell about ourselves and others. The history of dark-skinned Native Americans challenges us to rethink what we know about race and identity in America. It reminds us that the lines we draw between different racial groups are not always as clear-cut as we might think. In the end, the story of dark-skinned Native Americans is not just a story about the past. It is also a story about the present and the future. It is a story about how we understand ourselves, our history, and our place in the world. And it is a story that is still being written. The way we understand African American identity has dramatically shifted over time. For generations, a single narrative dominated. African Americans were believed to be solely the descendants of African slaves, brought through the brutal transatlantic slave trade to the Americas. This belief cast them as outsiders, torn from their homeland with a history linked only to enslavement and oppression. However, as we delve deeper into history, a hidden chapter is being revealed, one that challenges this long-standing view. Recent revelations suggest that many African Americans are not solely descended from African slaves but also from the indigenous peoples of America, dark-skinned tribes who lived here long before European settlers ever set foot on these lands. This powerful reawakening of identity prompts us to ask, what evidence supports the notion that African Americans have indigenous roots in America? In this video, we explore the fascinating and often overlooked history that rewrites what we thought we knew. Long before the arrival of European colonizers, the Americas were home to a rich tapestry of indigenous cultures. These tribes, varying in physical appearance, language, and customs, had lived on this land for thousands of years. Among them were groups that exhibited darker skin tones, striking features, and characteristics commonly associated with Africans. The Yamasee, Choctaw, and various tribes from the Caribbean and South America all shared these distinct traits. But European settlers, driven by their obsession with race and classification, misinterpreted the appearance of these dark-skinned natives. Many colonizers assumed they were of African descent and, as a result, these indigenous peoples were absorbed into the same category as African slaves. This false assumption, born from ignorance and racial bias, led to the erasure of their true identities as the original inhabitants of the Americas. Historical records, however, offer glimpses into their existence. Explorer James Adair, in his 1775 work, The History of the American Indians, described the diversity among Native American populations. He wrote of tribes with darker skin tones, which he compared to the Moors of Africa. Despite these observations, European colonizers persisted in lumping these tribes together with Africans, a misclassification that had devastating consequences. As colonial powers sought to impose rigid racial hierarchies, they categorized these dark-skinned indigenous tribes as black, erasing their unique heritage. This simplification served the colonizers' interests, as it reinforced the notion of European superiority and provided justification for both slavery and the seizure of native lands. Acknowledging these dark-skinned individuals as Native Americans would have disrupted the racial order the colonizers were building. Instead, by grouping them with African slaves, the settlers maintained the hierarchy that placed themselves at the top. This racial erasure was not just a loss of identity for the dark-skinned tribes, it also facilitated their exploitation. By blurring the lines between Native Americans and Africans, European settlers made it easier to enslave both groups, treating them as commodities to be bought and sold. Dark-skinned Native Americans were particularly vulnerable to this enslavement due to their physical resemblance to Africans. They were taken from their lands, stripped of their freedom, and subjected to the same dehumanizing conditions as African slaves. Between 1492 and 1880, an estimated 5 million Native Americans were enslaved alongside the 12.5 million Africans brought to the Americas. This dual system of enslavement blurred the distinctions between the two groups, leading to the tragic erasure of Native American identity within the African American community. As dark-skinned Native Americans were enslaved and forced to adopt the customs of their European captors, their languages, traditions, and spiritual practices were systematically suppressed. Over time, these dark-skinned indigenous peoples were absorbed into the larger African American population, their histories forgotten, their identities rewritten. The impact of this erasure is still felt today. Many African Americans, unaware of their Native American roots, identify solely with their African ancestry. Yet, evidence of this indigenous heritage remains in their physical traits, family stories, and cultural practices. Some African Americans today exhibit physical characteristics more commonly associated with Native Americans, such as high cheekbones, straight hair, and distinct skin tones. These traits are living reminders of a forgotten history, a history that challenges the simplistic narrative of African Americans being solely descended from African slaves. The U.S. government played a significant role in this erasure through policies like the Dawes Act of 1887. This legislation aimed to assimilate Native Americans into European American culture by breaking up communal tribal lands and dividing them into individual allotments. While Native Americans who were listed on tribal rolls were eligible to receive land, those of mixed African and Native American ancestry often faced obstacles in claiming their heritage. By reclassifying individuals with African ancestry as African Americans rather than Native Americans, the government effectively denied them land rights. This reclassification served two purposes. It reduced the number of people eligible for land allotments, increasing the amount of land available for European settlers, and it erased the indigenous identity of those with African ancestry. The Dawes Act allowed the government to seize surplus land that was not allotted to Native individuals and sell it to European settlers. By denying mixed-race individuals their Native American identity, the government facilitated the dispossession of native lands. Entire communities were displaced, their ancestral lands lost, and their cultural heritage erased. The reclassification of mixed-race individuals also had lasting cultural consequences. By categorizing these individuals as African Americans, The government contributed to the erasure of Native American heritage within the African American community. Over generations, African Americans with Native ancestry were taught to identify solely with their African roots, while their indigenous heritage was forgotten. This erasure was so effective that today, many African Americans are unaware of their Native American ancestry. The growing movement among African Americans to reclaim their Native heritage is a powerful response to centuries of historical erasure. As more people discover their indigenous roots, they are rediscovering the rich history and culture that was denied to their ancestors. The reclaiming of Native American ancestry is more than just a search for identity. It is a challenge to the narratives imposed by colonial powers. It is a way to honor the histories that were erased and to restore the dignity of those who were written out of history. So, what do we make of all this? Are African Americans today descendants of Native Americans, or of African slaves? The answer is not as simple as we've been led to believe. For many, the truth lies in a blend of both identities. African Americans are a diverse people with a history that spans continents, cultures, and centuries. Their ancestors include both Africans and indigenous peoples of America, each contributing to the rich tapestry of African American identity. As we continue to uncover the hidden history of African Americans' indigenous roots, we are reminded of the importance of reclaiming these stories. By acknowledging the full scope of African American heritage, we not only honor the past but also challenge the forces that sought to erase it. What do you think? Do you believe African Americans are more closely tied to Native Americans than previously thought? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. And if you're interested in learning more about this fascinating chapter of history, don't forget to subscribe to the Black History Archives and click the bell icon to stay updated on future videos. Thank you for your support, and let's continue to explore the stories that have been hidden for far too long.